The history of Israel has always been a battleground of faith, power, and survival. Once a land of prophecy and promise, it became the obsession of empires, the birthplace of religions, and the spark of endless conflict. The Egyptians enslaved its people, the Babylonians burned its temples, and the Romans sought to erase its identity. Yet, no conqueror could truly claim it. Revolts shattered empires, exiles fueled resilience, and generations fought to reclaim what was lost. But with each victory came new enemies, and with each rebirth, new struggles. But what happened next in the history of Israel? To understand the wars, the faith, and the unbreakable will of its people, we must go back to the very beginning. The story starts on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, known as the Levant, more specifically in Canaan. Bordered by the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River in the east, Canaan has left a lasting legacy on today's world since it is settled at a crossroads of civilizations. On the west, the sea connected it with Europe. On the south, there was the Arabian Peninsula. On the east, there was Mesopotamia, and on the north, Canaan was connected with the old civilizations in Anatolia and the Caucasus region. And that crossroad could lead on many sides. Phoenicians became skillful traders who gifted the world with a phonetic language, known as the alphabet that is still used today. During the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods, life flourished in this part of the world. With a lot of fertile plains, highlands, and most importantly, coastal access, it was natural that the prehistoric people would settle in Canaan. The main center and one of the earliest continuously inhabited cities in the world was Jericho in the valley of the Jordan River. Archaeological discoveries show that people living in Jericho even had defensive walls and towers. Almost 11 millennia old, Jericho still exists today, which makes it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. During these millenniums, many different tribes lived in these lands, but the emergence of Canaanites in the 3rd millennium BC changed everything. Very soon, these Semitic people founded city-states and trading began to flourish. Their states, including Jericho, Megiddo, and others, communicated with Mesopotamian states and Egypt. Being the crossroads of these civilizations, these Canaanite states accepted some foreign cultural customs, but also spread theirs. And the ancient Canaanites also worshipped multiple deities, like their neighbors in Egypt. But in this crossroad that was destined to become the Holy Land, something soon changed, and the stories of the founding of the world's first monotheistic religion. These stories cross the thin line between ancient history and mythology, mystifying even more the origins of Judaism. It all started with Abraham, a man born in Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia. The myth further says that he received a message from God to travel to Canaan and spread God's word. Abraham left the safety of his father's home, and he was promised that the land of Canaan would become his and his family's, along with God's blessing. His journey was full of obstacles like weather conditions and long wandering through inhospitable lands. Stories of his adventures are incoherent, and some even state that he visited Egypt. Jacob later had 12 sons who became the founding fathers of 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob also introduced the name Israel, but circumstances like the 7-year famine, and especially finding his son Joseph, made him relocate to Egypt, where he was greeted by the Pharaoh himself. With Jacob, the period of the patriarch was concluded, and the Israeli people entered the new era in Egypt. The one who started the era in Egypt was Joseph. Sold in slavery by his brother, Joseph quickly broke his shackles and became well respected by Pharaoh, who trusted Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Moses' story begins in the shadows of the greatest oppression. After that, he fled Egypt to Midian, and the history of the people of Israel was changed. One day, a burning bush caught his attention, and from that bush God spoke, appointing Moses to deliver the Israelites from Egypt's oppression. Moses confronted the new Pharaoh with God's command to, "Let my people go." After a negative response, Moses unleashed a series of plagues upon Egypt. The one that made the Pharaoh allow them to leave was the angel's killing of all firstborn Egyptian children, including Pharaoh's. The Pharaoh soon changed his mind and ordered the army to kill the Israelites, but Moses spread the Red Sea with his stick, saving his people. The sea later drowned the Egyptian army. In this exodus, Moses became not only a leader, but also a preacher, receiving the Ten Commandments atop Mount Sinai. Although there were some hard times and choices, Moses led his people through decades of wandering in the desert. As they neared the Promised Land, his journey came to an end. Forbidden to enter Canaan himself, he climbed Mount Nebo, where he saw the land from afar. There, he died, leaving behind a legacy as one of history's greatest leaders. After Moses' death, the Israelites, led by Joshua, entered the Promised Land. Since there were already Canaanites there, the settling of the Promised Land turned into conquest. Jericho was one of the first cities to fall under their rule. However, their unity soon fractured, and the era of the judges began. These leaders, who were both warriors and prophets, rose during times of crisis. These people brought temporary stability, but the cycle of faithfulness, sin, oppression, and redemption marked this period for generations. But everything changed in the 11th century BC, when from the ashes of chaos rose a dynasty that united the tribes and carved their names in the Israeli national identity. To study closely the period of the unified Kingdom of Israel, we, once again, must consult the Old Testament. Although it is not a very reliable source, in the lack of any other, we must turn to it. The Kingdom of Israel is said to have been formed in the late 11th century BC. Then the 12 tribes of Israel, scattered across the land of Canaan, finally unified under the rule of Saul. There are a few reasons why the tribes did that, and the main one was protection from external threats, mostly from the Philistines. The Philistines were a very powerful people, with a formidable navy in that time, and they often raided the southern coastal regions. Now, the first real state could finally resist their attacks, and Saul was in charge. Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, like Moses before him, was reluctant to unify the tribes and become a king, although anointed by the prophet Samuel. It is uncertain when this exactly happened, but some historians give us the year 1020 BC. Saul proved himself in battles against the Ammonites and Philistines. But the problem was that during his reign, Saul didn't work according to God's plan, and God didn't accept him as king anymore. Saul became too disobedient, and the punishment soon arrived. Somewhere around the year 1000 BC, Saul lost a battle, his army, and his life in the battle at Mount Gilboa against the Philistines when he intentionally fell on his sword, aware of inevitable defeat. 3 of Saul's sons also perished in the battle, and after 2 years of turmoil, David, his son-in-law, became the new king. David had modest origins. Although when God rejected Saul as king, the prophet Samuel selected David, his life didn't change. The youngest son in his household and a humble shepherd, David had little chance for any notable life before he encountered Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine warrior of imposing size. Although the height of 9 feet was clearly exaggerated, Goliath was a giant and the greatest weapon of the Philistine army. No one was brave enough to challenge him. David had come to the battlefield only to deliver food to his brothers. There, he heard Goliath cursing God, and that is when David lost sight of Goliath's size. He was sure God was on his side and even refused any weapons, except for 5 stones. While approaching Goliath, David taunted him and aimed with his sling. 1 shot in the forehead was enough to beat Goliath, whom David beheaded with his own sword. Israel won, and David became very respected, and King Saul's son-in-law. Soon, they became enemies. Although unaware of David's destiny, Saul was afraid of David's influence and possible power, and wanted him dead. Saul's attempts to kill him forced David to flee, leading to years of living as an outlaw. After Saul's untimely death, David was initially accepted as king only by his own tribe, Judah, ruling from Hebron for 7 years. As time passed, David managed to consolidate power and became king of Israel, supported by all tribes. It was he who established a new capital around 993 BC. This new capital, Jerusalem, is one of the most important cities. if not the most important, of all time. Living his life according to God's wishes, David's reign was prosperous and is still remembered as the golden age of Israel. The state was centralized, and the old enemies like the Philistines and Moabites lost some of their land in Israel's favor. Yet, there were some problems, especially in his personal life. David's affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband were scandalous and even led to some rebellions. Because of the bloodshed, God didn't allow David to construct a monumental temple in Jerusalem. That task was left to his son from Bathsheba, Solomon, who inherited his father somewhere around 970 BC. Unlike his father, Solomon's rule was marked by peace and building projects. The state of Israel was rapidly developing. Following David's death, his son Solomon inherited the throne, and the first temple in Jerusalem was finally completed around 957 BC. Built on Mount Moriah, the temple became the spiritual heart of Israel. Almost immediately after the construction was finished, the temple became home to the Ark of the Covenant. The luxury of the temple clearly showed how wealthy Solomon and Israel had become. Still, by the end of his rule, Solomon wasn't universally loved anymore. Heavy taxation needed to finance his projects turned the people against Solomon, and forced labor on these projects made them hate their king. He wasn't one of them anymore. He became distant. Also, many foreigners moved to Israel, and Solomon declared religious tolerance, which was one more thing the Israelites didn't like. An already unhappy kingdom, completely fragmented after Solomon's death, because his son Rehoboam refused to reduce taxes and forced labor, although there were not many projects anymore. This led to open mutiny, and 10 northern tribes formed the Kingdom of Israel, with Jeroboam I as the king, while Rehoboam retained control over Judah in the south. These two kingdoms of the same people became rivals, though both much weaker than a once united nation. Soon, both kingdoms became prey for powerful empires in their neighborhood. In 722 BC, the Kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrian Empire after a 3-year siege. People were forcibly deported and scattered across the empire. Today, they are known as the Lost Tribes of Israel, and their fate is still unknown. The Southern Kingdom survived the Assyrian Empire, but in 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem. The Babylonians burned the city, destroyed the first temple, and exiled many important figures to Babylon. This loss of independence and another period of exile really represented a challenge for the Israelite people and their faith. However, the Jewish community in exile stuck to their faith and continued practicing their traditions, only without the temple. There were even new prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Returning to the homeland was the dream they achieved in 539 BC, after almost 50 years of exile. The one who saved them was another conqueror. Only, this time, it was the Persian ruler who conquered Babylon. They came back home, but their world was forever changed, and the Israelite people needed to come to terms with that. For the Jewish people, the Persian conquest of Babylon was actually a liberation. The moment the Persian king Cyrus the Great entered Babylon meant the world for all the people forcibly exiled into Babylon, including Jews. Interestingly, even the Babylonian elite had little problems with foreign rule. For Israelis, it was a return to their old ways of faith. Words of prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah turned out to be true. They promised that their suffering would end, and that a return to Zion was just around the corner. Cyrus the Great proclaimed tolerance, and he allowed the Jews returning from exile to rebuild their temple. Among those who journeyed back was Zerubbabel, a descendant of the Davidic line, who took up the leadership in the formidable task of rebuilding the temple. Imagine the scene. Caravans winding their way through deserts and valleys, carrying not only supplies, but also the hopes and prayers of scattered people. The challenges were difficult to overcome, similar to those when the Jewish people first arrived: hostility from neighboring peoples, resource shortages, and internal doubts. But the vision of a restored Zion was above everything. The Second Temple's construction began in 516 BC. This new temple, though less luxurious than Solomon's, symbolized a new beginning and resilience of the people of Israel. The prophet Haggai spoke passionately to the people, urging them to complete the work despite their hardships. Is it time for you to live in your houses while this house lies in ruins? The return to Zion was not merely physical, as it was deeply spiritual and cultural as well. During this period, the foundation of Judaism as we know it today began to take shape. The Pentateuch, or Torah, was compiled and canonized, finally giving a written form to the oral traditions that had sustained the Jewish people through exile. During this era, besides the temple that was being built, believers started to construct synagogues as centers for worship and learning. The development of synagogues later proved very important for the survival of Judaism in later centuries. One figure who stands out during this transformative period is Ezra, the writer. A scholar and priest, Ezra led a second wave of exiles back to Jerusalem decades after the temple's reconstruction. His mission was clear: to re-establish the laws of Moses as the most important for Jewish life. One of the first things Ezra did when he arrived in Jerusalem was to gather people on the square and read the Torah. These words from the sacred text were a reminder to the people who they were. A renewal of identity. From that moment, the Torah was no longer a distant relic, but a living guide for the community. In that way, during the uncertain times for the temple, Judaism became the fate more turned to the sacred texts rather than to the one special sacred monument. And Ezra still influences the Jewish community because he founded the Great Assembly, where 120 leaders gathered to codify all the Jewish customs. Under Ezra's guidance, the Great Assembly formalized prayers and blessings and also added public readings of the Torah. That helped the teachings to reach the community. Ezra's dedication to the Torah was above all else, for Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach its statutes and rules in Israel, the scriptures note. Ezra's efforts once again awakened Jewish religious identity. With public reading of the Torah, Ezra brought all people to the only righteous path, and that gave him the nickname Father of Judaism. His reforms were not without controversy. Marriages with non-Jewish populations had become common, and Ezra's insistence on strict obedience to the Torah created tensions within the community. That period of Persian rule was full of respect for local customs and religions that allowed for a relatively harmonious coexistence of cultures. The Jews, as loyal subjects, thrived under Persian patronage while maintaining their distinct identity. They also had a degree of autonomy under the governance of high priests and local leaders, but that time didn't last forever. The return to Zion and religious tolerance were not the end of the story. Something was changing, and soon their world would be overwhelmed by an unknown power. The fragile peace of the Persian era would give way to the storm of wars and conquests, setting the stage for a new chapter of survival of Jewish people. In 336 BC, a new threat from the west emerged. Greece was finally united under Macedonian rule, and the new young king wanted to even the score with Persia more than 100 years after Persia attacked the Greek world. His name was Alexander, and this name will remain in the echoes of history for eternity. Besides conquering Persia, Alexander the Great influenced Israel in many ways. First, once again, these people got new foreign masters, but this one also wanted to change the culture of many nations that he ruled over and blend them into one nation. Born in Macedonia, Alexander was tutored by Aristotle and raised in Greek traditions. From a young age, he believed he was destined for greatness. Alexander was a military genius and very ambitious in his quest for glory. Still, he was surprised that something that had begun as a mere Greek campaign to avenge earlier Persian invasions soon became something monumental that changed the course of history in this part of the world. From Greece, Alexander led his armies across Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, before striking deep into Persia and eventually reaching as far as the Indus Valley. And among all those places was Israel. And that's how the Hellenistic period began, where Greek language, art, and philosophy influenced societies from Egypt to India. This influence also affected Judea, but with significant resistance. Although some Jews accepted this blending of Greek and Eastern cultures, others fiercely defended their traditions, openly opposing the Macedonian rulers. The highlight of this tension happened almost 2 centuries after Alexander, when his empire was already divided by his officers. Seleucid king Antiochus IV, Epiphanes decided to completely unify his kingdom through Hellenization, although his predecessors had tolerated Jewish faith. Antiochus forbade Jewish religious practices and even desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, where he put an altar dedicated to Zeus. In a matter of days, the whole of Judea rose to revolt. The revolt began in the town of Modian, where the authorities demanded that the Jewish priest Mattathias sacrifice to a pagan god. Mattathias refused and killed both the officer and a Jewish collaborator. Soon, he led the guerrilla resistance. After Mattathias' death in 166 BC, during the second year of the revolt, the leadership passed to his son, Judah Maccabee, also known as Judah the Hammer for his ferocity in battle. This Maccabean revolt got its name from this leader. Judah Maccabee was a skillful military leader who masterfully used guerrilla tactics to attack the stronger Seleucid forces. Rebel forces grew stronger by the day, strong enough to attack fortified cities and even liberate Jerusalem after the Battle of Beth Zur. This well-organized ambush in 164 BC allowed the Maccabees to liberate their capital and once again restore the temple to its original purpose. That victory is marked by the festival of Hanukkah, still celebrated today among the Jewish community. Sadly, the revolt was also partially a civil war between anti-Greek and Greek-friendly Jews. Although Judah Maccabee perished in 160 BC, the revolt did not end with his death, as his brothers took over. Eventually, this revolt secured fragile autonomy, followed by occasional skirmishes between the Maccabees and Seleucids. During this period, Simon Thassi, one of the brothers, was recognized as both the high priest and ruler of Judea. He established the Hasmonean dynasty. But one new power also took part in this Jewish struggle. The Roman Republic used diplomatic means to help Judea against the Seleucids and, in doing so, gained influence in this semi-independent state. Still, this was a rare period of self-rule for the Jewish people. But, like it always happened before, internal divisions sowed the seeds of downfall, and Rome also helped. For decades, Rome had been expanding eastward, eventually conquering the Seleucid Empire. In the 70s BC, 2 brothers from the Hasmonean dynasty, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus Thicus, claimed the throne, and both factions turned to Pompey for support, practically inviting Rome to establish influence. Pompey saw the opportunity to bring Judea under Roman control. Initially attempting diplomacy, he was met with resistance when Aristobulus fortified Jerusalem. Pompey marched on the city, leading to a brutal siege. After 3 months, the city walls fell, and bloodshed followed. From that moment, Judea became a client kingdom, ruled by Roman-controlled figures like Herod the Great. His reign showed that the fire shines the brightest before the end. Grand projects like the expansion of the Second Temple, the fortress at Masada, and the port city of Caesarea Maritima stand as proof of this. Yet, his heavy taxation and allegiance to Rome made him hated among his subjects. After Herod's death in 4 BC, the kingdom was divided among his sons, who couldn't control the state, and Rome annexed Judea in 6 AD. Roman rule in Judea was fraught with tension as the Jewish people resisted another foreign domination. Although some governors like Pontius Pilate occasionally cooperated with Jewish leaders, it all led to open rebellion in the following decades. In 66 AD, the First Jewish-Roman War started due to heavy taxation. At first, the Jewish rebels surprised the Romans and achieved significant success. Led by groups such as the Zealots and the Sicarii, they even liberated Jerusalem. For 4 years, they defied Rome's might, but their ultimate defeat brought unprecedented punishment. The Romans won the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD by starving the city and breaching the walls of its severely weakened defenders. The punishment was the destruction of the Second Temple, the most devastating event any Jew had to witness and endure. The only part still remaining is the Western Wall, today known as the Wailing Wall, probably the most sacred place for any Jew. Before being destroyed, the temple was robbed and its treasures were carried off to Rome. The Arch of Titus, who led the Roman army and later became emperor, clearly depicts these events. The Jews scattered across the empire. However, they once again rebelled 4 decades later during the Kitos War, but the Roman response was even harsher, and Emperor Trajan quickly suppressed the rebellion. Yet, the Jewish people were not done resisting. In 132, under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, they launched another desperate revolt against Rome. Initially successful, Bar Kokhba's forces even reclaimed Jerusalem. However, the Romans methodically destroyed fortresses one by one. The last one standing was Beitar, where Bar Kokhba met his end in a brutal massacre. After this revolt, Rome erased Judea's name, renaming it Syria Palestina, and banned Jews from Jerusalem. The Jewish population was forcibly dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. From that moment on, Jewish history continued beyond Israel, shaping the diaspora legacy. Eventually, Rome fell, and new nations arose on its ruins. In the neighborhood of Judea, a new religion and a new strong nation decided to make its mark. What came next was not merely the continuation of history, but the beginning of a transformative new chapter for humanity. In the next few centuries, Jerusalem stood as another proud Roman city, Aliyah Capitolina, with pagan temples standing where the Jewish temple once was. For the remaining Jews in Palestine, life became a quiet struggle to preserve their traditions in the ruins of a shattered society. Soon, they became a minority. Jewish villages still existed in Galilee and other rural and far-reachable areas, where small communities tried to rebuild lives centered on agriculture and local trade. They gathered in small synagogues, clinging to their faith and shared history. As the centuries passed, Rome paved the way for the Christian Byzantine Empire, and Jerusalem was also a holy city for Christians. This new religion, a state religion, represented a new challenge for Jews, and some new restrictions for them were imposed. They were forbidden to work in administration, and the construction of synagogues was strictly limited. In Jerusalem, Christian leaders reinforced the ban on Jewish entry, turning the city into a symbol of exclusion, blaming Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. By the 6th century, emperors, especially Justinian I, added harsher measures, including interference in Jewish religious practices. This made many more leave their homeland. In exile, Jewish life evolved in remarkable ways. Once again, they found peace under Persian rule, especially in Babylon, where they had religious freedom. There, rabbis compiled the Babylonian Talmud, further codifying religious practices. Elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, Jewish communities adapted to their circumstances. In Egypt, North Africa, and parts of Europe, Jews worked as merchants, artisans, and scholars, contributing to the economies of the cities they inhabited. but their safety was never guaranteed. The arrival of Islam and the Muslim conquest of Judea in the 7th century changed the landscape of Jewish life in the Levant and beyond. When Muslim armies swept through Palestine, they ended Byzantine rule and started a new era. Once again, the change of foreign masters influenced the remaining Jews in Palestine and improved their position. Under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. Although they paid a special tax, they were protected as people of the book, which was much better than under the Byzantine Empire. In cities like Tiberias and Safed, Jewish communities began to revive. Galilee became a hub for Jewish mysticism and study, with scholars interpreting ancient texts and preserving traditions. Still, this period of relative calm was not without its challenges. Whenever there were problems under the Abbasid Caliphate, economic hardship, increased taxes, and occasional persecution disrupted the fragile balance between Muslim rulers and their Jewish subjects. Diaspora, on the other hand, experienced much harsher anti-Semitism, but in some places, unprecedented freedom. In Spain, under Muslim rule, Jewish communities experienced a golden age of cultural flourishing. Jewish poets, philosophers, and scientists became integral to the intellectual life of Al-Andalus. In Christian Europe, anti-Semitism prevailed. As medieval Christendom solidified its power, Jews found themselves increasingly marginalized. Restrictions on professions, accusations of heresy, and violent outbreaks were common. Blood libels, false accusations that Jews used the blood of Christian children in rituals, spread fear and hatred, setting the stage for centuries of persecution. And that persecutions maximally increased at the end of the 11th century. The series of wars nobody expected shook the Holy Land, and although the Jews didn't directly participate, they were very important pieces in the puzzle of history. Western Europe survived the Dark Ages stronger and more devout, which heavily influenced the Jewish people, not in a good way. The Pope in Rome became the main political force in Europe. On the false pretext of helping the Byzantines, Pope Urban II decided to show his might. His goal became Jerusalem, now the holy city for all three major religions, under Muslim Fatimid control. The Crusader call to arms promised liberation of the Holy Land, though only for Christians, and the people responded. Christian fanatics even went on foot, even though they were not soldiers. As this so-called People's Crusade marched through the Rhineland, these mobs turned against Jews, who were massacred. Some Jews chose martyrdom over forced conversion. It was just a sinister prelude to what followed. When the Crusaders finally captured Jerusalem in 1099, they started slaughtering randomly. Tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were killed. In one of the city's synagogues, Jews who had taken refuge were burned alive by the invaders. Jerusalem, once the hope of restoration, became a city of death for its Jewish inhabitants. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established alongside other Crusader states like Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa. Christian knights governed a population that included Muslims and Jews. At times, trade and cultural exchange flourished, but occasional violence was always a possibility. The first one to fall was Edessa, less than 50 years after the Crusade, which led to the new one. This one was a complete failure, but the Second Crusade also included a campaign in Iberia, where they captured Muslim-held cities like Lisbon and Almeria, severely limiting any rights of the Jewish population. Under Crusader rule, Jerusalem was transformed into the heart of the Latin Kingdom, governed by feudal lords and defended by military orders such as the Knights Templar. It was a real embassy of Western Europe in the East. While Christians celebrated their dominance, the city's Jewish and Muslim populations faced oppression. Jews were once again expelled from the city and stripped of religious freedoms, while Muslims endured heavy taxation and the desecration of sacred sites like the Dome of the Rock. The lack of any resistance from the Jews showed the desperate situation they were in, but nothing lasts forever. By the mid-12th century, Muslim unity began to crystallize under strong leaders who sought to reclaim the Holy Land. Among them, Nur al-Din Zengi played a crucial role in consolidating power in Syria and northern Iraq. His successor, Saladin, expanded this legacy dramatically. An intellectual who could have possibly become a scholar if he wanted to, a charismatic and devout leader, Saladin became the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, uniting much of the Islamic world under his banner. He was the best thing that could have happened to the Muslim world at the time of the Crusades. Righteous and a military genius, Saladin prioritized the religious and strategic importance of Jerusalem as both a political goal and a sacred duty. The Crusader states, meanwhile, were suffering from deep internal problems and external threats. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was weakened by a succession crisis and a lack of strong leadership. King Baldwin IV suffered from leprosy, which limited his ability to lead. After his death in 1185, the rivalry for succession began. This disunity made the kingdom increasingly vulnerable to Saladin's expanding power. After a dominant win in the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin launched a campaign against the Crusader states. During the battle, the Crusaders were surrounded, exhausted, and without access to water. Most of the Crusader army was either killed or captured. Saladin followed this victory with a series of attacks, capturing Jerusalem in October of the same year. He was much more merciful, allowing the Christians to leave the city unharmed after paying ransom. This led to the Third Crusade, led by the King of England, Richard the Lionheart. After he arrived in Acre, Richard wanted to conquer Jerusalem, but eventually decided to secure Jaffa, where, after a few battles, he signed the Treaty of Jaffa. There, they decided that Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands while Christians had open access to their churches, unarmed. Jews were not mentioned in this arrangement, but something was changing, something that would ignite a new age of exploration, trade, and conquest. The world was about to be overwhelmed by an unknown power, and the age of empires was just beginning. After the Crusades, the Holy Land was depleted. Since it was a battleground for so many decades, with slaughtering and massacres that followed, many villages basically disappeared from the face of the earth. Still, Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of three great religions, and no one wanted to give up. Christians still had their small and weakened crusade states while the Muslims were on the rise. The Jews, on the other, had only had a dream of their city once again in their possession. A dream that was more than 1,000 years long at that point. The Crusader states continued to weaken, losing territories in favor of Muslim rulers. By 1291, the last stronghold, Acre, fell, marking the end of Crusader rule in the Holy Land. And how expelled them. Once enslaved soldiers from the Caucasian region, who were probably Turks, rose and became leading figures in many Muslim states, especially in the Ayyubid Sultanate in Egypt. They were known as the Mamluks, and they managed to overthrow the Ayyubid dynasty in 1250, creating the Mamluk Sultanate. They were a strong military state that even managed to fight with the Mongols. After consolidating their power in Egypt, the Mamluks turned their attention to the remaining Crusader states and in 1291, finally destroyed the last political legacy of these wars. This victory was more than just a military triumph, as it represented Islamic dominance in a region that had been a battleground between Christian and Muslim forces for 2 centuries. But 3 decades before the expulsion of the Crusaders, Mamluks took control of Jerusalem when they entered the city after the victory in the Battle of Ain Jalut. The period between 1230 and 1260 was particularly unstable, and Jerusalem had few sieges and even a brief Christian rule. The Mamluks' triumph brought an era of stability. Since the Mamluks ruled their possessions with a firm grip, constantly being afraid of rebellion. However, this era had many bright sides for Jerusalem and its population. It was during the Mamluk rule that the important defensive project of the fortification of Jerusalem's walls was being done. Also, the Islamic rule in these centuries could be considered as much more prosperous than the European, with the Mamluks encouraging trade, learning, and architectural development. But there were some downsides also. The Mamluks' encouragement of trade didn't include Jerusalem, and it became only a religious center where people of other religions had to pay special heavy taxes, other than the Muslims. Also, the persecutions in 1267 and forcible conversions in the 14th century didn't help the Jewish community in the city. The region remained restless, with tensions between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Although the Mamluks tried to establish the time of peace, for the time being, they imposed strict Muslim rule. But as their nation started to weaken, the new Muslim nation wanted their territory, including Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire, now firmly in control of the Balkans and most of Pannonian Plain, still wasn't considered the Muslim powerhouse nation. And Sultan Selim, I decided to change that. Also known as Selim the Grim, he was very ambitious and ruthless. The most important thing during his rule was his authority, imposed by harsh measures if needed. The other important trait was Selim's deep devotion to religion, and he viewed himself as a protector of Sunni Islam. Also, he was a brilliant military leader, offended by some Mamluks' actions. His answer was swift. Selim lured the Mamluks to the battlefield at Marj Dabik, and in one decisive battle effectively ended the existence of their nation in 1516. The Ottomans took control of Palestine, including Jerusalem. The fall of the Mamluks and the Ottoman takeover changed everything in this region. The Ottomans brought with them new administrative structures, architectural designs, and a shift in governance that would have a lasting impact on the region. One thing, though, didn't change. The Holy City was still under Islamic rule. Unlike the Mamluks, the Ottomans were careful to respect the religious significance of Jerusalem to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, at least in the beginning. This would allow the city to maintain its status as a center of pilgrimage for all three Abrahamic faiths. Under Ottoman rule, the region experienced a period of real stability because, for the first time since being a part of the Roman Empire, Jerusalem was in the hands of one of, if not the mightiest nation in the world. The Jews still had to pay the protection tax, but were allowed to practice their faith freely, and the Jewish community flourished, especially after the expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal. These people who left Europe mostly settled in Thessaloniki, or back home in Jerusalem. The Ottomans focused on developing the infrastructure and constructed roads, bridges, and markets. Sultan Suleiman once again repaired the walls. Still, from time to time, there were periods of hardship for the Jews, and the city itself faced economic decline, starting from the early 17th century. But other Jewish centers progressed, at least in a religious way. Cities like Safed or Tiberias also had strong religious leaders and groups, particularly in Saft, where Kabbalah, the mystical interpretation of the Torah, began to take root. As the centuries progressed, the Ottoman Empire started to lose the technology race against the European powers. That also led to their military defeats. Once mighty empire became a battleground for the European powers looking to establish influence and take as much wealth as possible from the Ottomans. Also, these European powers became very interested in the Holy Land. Britain, France, and Russia began to fight for influence in Palestine, using religious and political alliances to further their agendas. This foreign interest had a direct impact on the region's Jewish population, as it led to an increase in Jewish immigration. Although many Jews already returned from all across Europe in previous centuries, as the Ottoman Empire weakened, Jews from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire began to rush to Palestine, seeking to build new lives in the land they considered their home. The weakening of Ottoman control over Palestine unsettled local populations, particularly the Jews and Arabs, who began to seek greater autonomy. But what happens next will change the Jewish world forever. Only Jews themselves could fight for their cause, and the spark came from the most unexpected place. After so much destruction and devastation in Judea, particularly under Roman rule, Jewish communities were scattered across the globe in what became known as the Jewish diaspora. For centuries, they lived as minorities in foreign lands, sometimes tolerated, but often persecuted. By the 19th century, their longing for a homeland had not vanished. It remained a quiet undercurrent in Jewish life, a memory passed through generations. And then came a turning point. The 19th century was the age of nationalism. Across Europe, multi-ethnic empires ruled over diverse populations, and many of these groups began demanding self-determination. The Czechs, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Serbs, nations without states, started to rebel against imperial rule, asserting their right to form independent homelands. But they weren't alone. The Jews, though scattered and stateless, also felt the stirrings of national revival. In this era, people began to define themselves not just by religion or local identity, but by language, shared history, and the dream of nationhood. For Jews, however, things were far more complex. Living as a minority in every country, with no territory to call their own, they were often regarded as outsiders, suspect, alien, and sometimes dangerous. In many nationalist movements, anti-Semitism was not an accidental feature, it was a defining element. Anti-Semitism was spreading rapidly across Europe, and it was no longer just confined to old religious prejudices. It took new racial and political forms. It wasn't just about social exclusion or legal restrictions. It turned violent. Pogroms, organized massacres, and riots swept through Eastern Europe, especially in the Russian Empire. Synagogues were torched, Jewish homes looted, and communities destroyed. It was terror, and it was often state-sanctioned or ignored. Western Europe, though more liberal, was not immune. The Dreyfus Affair in France became a symbol of this growing hatred. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of treason in 1894. Despite the lack of credible evidence, he was convicted and sent into exile. Why? Because he was Jewish. The French public was bitterly divided. Even when Dreyfus was proven innocent, many refused to admit it. The scandal revealed a deep rot in even the most enlightened European societies. Jews could never truly belong. This rising tide of hatred convinced many Jews that they could no longer rely on the promise of assimilation. Among them was Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist and playwright born in Budapest in 1860. He was highly educated, well integrated into European society, and at first believed that Jews could find acceptance by adopting the customs of the majority. But the Dreyfus Affair shattered that illusion. Reporting from Paris as a correspondent, Herzl saw firsthand how fragile Jewish safety truly was. For Herzl, the answer became painfully clear. The Jews needed their own homeland, a place where they could live free of fear, rebuild their identity, and control their future. He imagined a state, not just a refuge, but a rebirth. In 1897, he turned vision into action. He convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, uniting Jewish leaders and thinkers under one purpose: the creation of a Jewish homeland. At the end of the Congress, Herzl wrote in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If not in 5 years, then certainly in 50. Everyone will see it." The proposed homeland was in Palestine, or as Jews often called it, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. At the time, Palestine was still under Ottoman rule. The once mighty Ottoman Empire was in decline, struggling to hold on to its distant provinces. Palestine had become a backwater, rural, underdeveloped, and overlooked. Cities like Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa were small, fragmented places, surrounded by villages populated by Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews. But to Zionist thinkers, Palestine was not just a piece of land. It was the historical and spiritual homeland of the Jewish people, where kings like David and Solomon once ruled, where prophets walked, and where the Jewish temple once stood. The vision of return, long cherished in Jewish prayers and texts, now began to take political form. In the 1880s, long before Herzl's Congress, the first Jewish migrants had already begun arriving. Many came not as ideologues, but as refugees. Pogroms tore through towns and villages. Jewish communities were devastated. The trauma forced many to leave. Some went to America, others to Western Europe. But a small group turned south, toward Palestine. This wave became known as the first Aliyah, a Hebrew word meaning ascent, referring to immigration to the Holy Land. It began in 1882 and lasted into the early 20th century. About 30,000 Jews arrived in Palestine during this period, mostly from Eastern Europe and Yemen. Many were driven by ideology, Zionist dreamers who believed they were rebuilding the Jewish homeland. Others were simply escaping the horrors of pogroms. But life in Palestine was not easy. The climate was harsh, the land unfamiliar, and disease widespread. Many of the settlers were urban Jews who had no farming experience. Struggled to cultivate the land and clashed with local populations. Tensions emerged, not only with Muslims who made up the majority in Palestine, but sometimes with Christians and even existing Jewish communities who viewed the newcomers with suspicion. To survive, the settlers needed help. That help came from wealthy Jewish philanthropists in Europe. Chief among them was Baron Edmund de Rothschild, a French Jewish banker who believed in the Zionist cause. He funded agricultural settlements, built infrastructure, and sent European experts to guide the colonists. Rothschild's support was crucial. Without it, many early communities might not have survived. But his involvement also came with strings attached. He exercised heavy control over the settlements, limiting their independence. Some settlers resented this, feeling like employees instead of pioneers. Still, despite hardship, disease, and local hostility, the first Aliyah laid the groundwork for what would come. New towns were established, such as Rishon LeZion, Petah Tikva, and Zikron Yaakov. A new Jewish presence was forming, not just spiritual, but physical. The Ottoman Empire, already suspicious of foreign influence, viewed Zionist immigration with growing alarm. Fearing unrest in a religiously sensitive area like Palestine, the Ottomans began placing restrictions on Jewish land purchases and immigration. But their control, especially in distant provinces, was limited. In many areas, local Arab leaders and communities held more sway than the government in Istanbul. And they, too, began to see the Zionists not as mere refugees, but as colonizers with a political agenda. Tensions grew. The dream of Zionism was running into the harsh reality of geopolitics. The early Zionists believed in peaceful settlement, diplomacy, and cooperation. Herzl envisioned negotiations with the Ottomans, the European powers, and even local Arabs. But history would soon show how fragile that dream was. Competing nationalisms, Jewish and Arab, would begin to clash in the decades to come. And so, as the 19th century faded into the 20th, Zionism stood at a crossroads. It had transformed from a dream into an organized movement. It had planted roots in the soil of Palestine, but the land was complex, crowded, and contested. The road ahead would be full of obstacles, rival empires, political resistance, and violent conflict. But for many Jews, there was no turning back. The old world had shut its doors. The promise of equality in Europe had failed. Zionism had become not just a hope, but a necessity. As Herzl once wrote, "If you will it, it is no dream." Now, the challenge was to turn that dream into reality in a land sacred to many and watched closely by the world. World War I began in 1914 during the time of Jewish migration to their ancestral home, still belonging to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, and its territories became desirable for the Allied powers. The Ottoman provinces were very diverse in ethnicities, languages, and faiths. Palestine, a fertile yet strategically modest region, suddenly became a prize. The war reality transformed life for all its inhabitants, including the Jewish community. The Ottoman administration in Jerusalem, led by the harsh military governor Jamal Pasha, implemented oppressive policies. Jews, particularly recent Zionist immigrants from Russia and Europe, found themselves in an awful position. The Ottomans, suspicious of foreign loyalties, deported many Jews as enemy nationals, while others were conscripted into the Ottoman army under harsh conditions. The Jewish community, estimated at 85,000 in 1914, suffered under wartime shortages, disease, and poverty, and the constant flow of funds from Jewish philanthropies abroad declined due to war difficulties. Zionist organizations struggled to maintain agricultural colonies, many of which faced ruin. On the other side, major European forces shared the Ottoman Empire, including Palestine, among themselves. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the region between Britain and France. This new circumstance had one important consequence: decades and decades of unrest, because they didn't care about the people inhabiting them. But there was another promise, a public one that carried even more consequences. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a statement of support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This document, just 67 words long, carried the seed of many changes and conflicts. Jews fleeing European persecution viewed Palestine as both a sanctuary and a rebirth of biblical promises. Yet, this declaration completely ignored the Arab population, the overwhelming majority of Palestine's inhabitants. But why did the Brits do that? There were two reasons. The first one was Palestine's proximity to the Suez Canal, the most important route of the British imperial trade and military operations. By supporting Zionist aspirations, Britain hoped to secure influence in the region post-war. And the second one was of a personal nature. Some of the leaders of the Zionist movement, like Chaim Weizmann, developed close relations with influential British leading politicians. Weizmann was a chemist who had many connections with high society, and he used that to promote Zionists' cause. Britain's government saw an opportunity to influence this area, economically promoting humanitarian causes. That way, with the declaration, Great Britain clearly chose a side in the rising Arab-Jewish conflict. The British declaration came as a fulfillment of a long-awaited dream for all the Zionists. Jewish people who lived in Palestine got hope of a better tomorrow under the protection of the world's largest empire. The moment of a long-awaited national home was just around the corner. From this point on, many more Jews decided to move to Palestine, feeling the support they would have. But some other people also lived there, and they were not Jewish, and they were far from happy. The Arab population in Palestine saw the Balfour Declaration as an attack on their homeland. They lived for generations in that place and didn't want to live in the Jewish state. They also started the question of Britain's right to divide other nations' lands, especially without consulting anyone, like the Arab leaders. This declaration created a conflict that lasted for more than a century and is far from any solutions, although, in the time of the fragmentation of empires, it would be very hard to resolve that mixture of people in Palestine without conflicts. Obviously, ever-present tensions between Arab and Jewish communities soon escalated into violence. Even Arthur Balfour himself later confirmed that the area of the Holy Land is very complex, and the declaration didn't help in resolving any problems, but from Britain's point of view, it was the best possible decision. Actually, Balfour and the British government only cared about their interests and influence in the region and the Middle East in general. And one more important thing, Balfour's declaration was just a promise of hope, nothing else, but it shaped one of the most stubborn and blood-stained conflicts in the 20th century. As the Great War drew to a close, British forces under General Edmund Allenby advanced into Palestine, expelling the Ottoman armies. The fall of Jerusalem was especially celebrated in Britain. Today, Allenby proclaimed, "The Crusaders have returned." These words couldn't be far from the truth, since Great Britain was an empire that split nations with straight lines on the map. With the League of Nations blessing in 1920, Britain assumed the mandate for Palestine, tasked with preparing the territory for self-rule. Also, using the resources from the land. This mandate had a lot of problems because the British wanted to make the Jewish home possible and also protect the rights of the Arabs, who were the majority, by the way. And on top of all that, the Jewish migrations continued and intensified. These new settlers drained swamps and built collective farms. One of their main achievements was the establishment of the new urban center on the seaside. Tel Aviv became a modern city from the moment of its foundation, showing the European customs of these settlers. Arabs in Palestine couldn't allow the loss of their land since they viewed these migrations as colonization, taking their land and threatening their way of life. "We are not against Jews as people, but we reject their colonial ambitions in our land," said Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Riots started almost immediately in Jerusalem in 1920, and Jaffa in 1921 left hundreds dead and wounded on both sides. The British couldn't handle the situation and tried to ease the Arabs by declaring immigration quotas for the Jews in order to slow down the migration. That didn't help, but enraged the Zionists. In the 1930s, it became even worse. The greatest evil in the history of our planet was on the rise in Germany, targeting especially Jews. Many sought refuge in Palestine, fleeing from the Nazis, which led to thousands more arriving. Each arrival added to Arab fears of demographic and political displacement, so they revolted. The Arab Revolt of 1936 lasted until 1939 and was pointed against the Jews, but also against the British. These two allied and the British forces relied on Jewish militias to help them fight the Arabs. Atrocities against civilians became regular on both sides. Finally, Arabs couldn't fight anymore, and the revolt crashed, but the British changed their policy by issuing the White Paper. The White Paper severely restricted the migration of Jews and put restrictions on their buying of land. It also promised the Arabs their own state. The moment couldn't be worse for the Jews, since their world in Europe was crashing and they were trying to find home. But that was just the beginning, and the worst episode in the history of the Jewish people was about to start. The year was 1933 and the government change in Germany. A moment that happens so often in every European nation, but also the moment that shaped the history of the world and led to the annihilation of Jews. Adolf Hitler took power in Germany and started fulfilling his ambition. People without their homeland became persecuted. Hitler, an unsuccessful painter, spread his agenda about the betrayal that led to the loss of the Great War, and the Jews as the ones who committed that betrayal. In his plans and in the Nazi program, he proclaims the purity of the race and the Jewish menace. Although he was not taken seriously by many, from that cold January morning in 1933, everything changed for the Jews in Europe. From the first moment, Jews in Germany were increasingly marginalized by a series of anti-Semitic laws that restricted their rights. Many lost jobs, scholarships, and the right to participate in public life. The next step was the Nazis launching their infamous Nuremberg laws in 1935, which excluded Jews from all aspects of public life, including citizenship, professions, and cultural participation. But besides his personal war against Jews, Hitler also worked on increasing Germany's size. Soon, the situation Jews had to endure in Germany became mirrored in the countries occupied by the Nazis. Actually, in the occupied territories, the Nazis were even more brutal, and a systematic approach was taken. The spread of Nazi Germany is very well known, so there is no need to get into many details about that. During this, yet relatively peaceful period in 1938 and 1939, they annexed Austria and most of Czechoslovakia. Of course, this period wasn't at least peaceful, especially the one night in 1938. It was a breezy autumn day when a Polish Jew named Herschel Grinspan heard the news about his parents. They were expelled from Germany, stuck on the border, homeless and hopeless. His reaction was quick and without thought, because he decided to assassinate the German diplomat in France, where Grinspan lived. The Nazis couldn't wish for a better excuse to unleash brute terror on Jews, the terrorist element in their country. The night between the 9th and 10th of November was lawless. That night, across Germany and Austria, the SS and civilians started a bloody orgy of death and destruction through Jewish neighborhoods. Synagogues were burned, Jewish-owned businesses were smashed and looted, and their glass storefronts shattered looked like crystals, giving the pogrom its grim name. Homes were invaded, and families were dragged into the streets, beaten and humiliated. The summary of the night was devastating. Over 1,400 synagogues had been destroyed, plus numerous Jewish businesses and homes. Almost 100 Jews were murdered, while 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. On top of all that, the Jewish community had to pay a hefty fine for the damage. And it was just the beginning of even more sinister plans in the following years. After 1939 and the beginning of World War II, Germany and its satellites controlled most of Europe, and the Jews living in those places had to run for their lives, mostly failing. The Nazis were not just at war with other nations, they were at war with an entire race of people, and the man who was one of the main architects of Kristallnacht had new ideas, even darker than before. Reinhard Heydrich was a very intelligent man, whose intelligence could only be measured by his ambition. Also, the lack of moral compass and human compassion helped in shaping this man as one of the most memorable Nazi leaders. Born in 1904, Heydrich was described as brilliant and arrogant. After a scandal ruined his career in the Navy in 1931, his only chance was the SS and Heinrich Himmler. There, he again progressed with astonishing speed, and Hitler even gave him a nickname: the man with the iron heart. Soon, Heydrich became one of the architects of the Holocaust. His cold efficiency, where he observed people as numbers, made him perfect for that new plan, made in 1941. After all, he truly believed in the Nazi vision of racial purity. With Heydrich's help, the Nazis started working on their plan for the final solution, which was a systematic genocide. Systematic genocide that should have wiped the Jewish name from the face of the earth. People were dehumanized, treated as numbers, killed on the spot, buried at mass graves, and sent in cargo trains to places like Auschwitz and Treblinka. There, millions of Jews were killed in gas chambers, through starvation and by brutal force. It was gut-wrenching, and no one was spared, not even children. Brutal sadists even made these dying moments of poor people even worse. And as the war progressed, it became clear the Holocaust was not spontaneous, but the culmination of years of escalation. And when they started losing the war, the full extent of the Holocaust became tragically clear. Everyone was shocked. Still, the question remains, was the anti-Semitism present in other nations that some of them turned a blind eye to the horrific reports, or did everything seem too incredible for them? 6 million Jews became victims of deranged culture, along with millions of other victims of various nations. It is the most tragic story of the 20th century. With so many Jewish communities destroyed, the survivors were scattered across Europe. The question of what to do with the Jewish refugees was often brought up. The Jews mostly wanted to go to the place they called home and create a Jewish state in Palestine. By the end of World War II, the British were under enormous pressure from both Jews and Arabs who wanted this territory for themselves. For the Jews, the Holocaust clearly showed they would never be protected without their own state. The Zionist movement also gained many followers after the war. Jewish survivors of concentration camps rushed to Palestine, and the British eventually decided to withdraw after they created large problems in Palestine. They messed up and let the international community resolve it. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a division of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Jewish community accepted the plan, but the Arab community rejected it. in 1948, as British rule officially ended. The Jews barely survived probably the world's worst genocide, organized in just a few years, but their struggle was far from over, and they had to fight once again. But even in the shadow of this darkest chapter, the Jewish people found a way to rise again. Their journey was not over. It had just begun, and in 1948, everything changed for the better. It was the spring of 1948, and the British had left the Holy Land after 3 decades of colonial rule. Jews and Arabs were left to solve their differences alone, without anyone in between. The main problem was that these differences were irreconcilable, although the Jewish side agreed to the division a year before. And since there was no possibility of compromise, one side decided to take drastic actions. These drastic actions became monumental. A fulfillment of a 2-millennium-long dream of an independent Jewish state, and all that in the middle of the century that saw the worst that could possibly happen to any nation. The State of Israel was born from the ashes of a century filled with persecution and warfare. All the centuries of wandering, suffering, and hope led to this moment. And although it may look like an impulsive and drastic action, taken without worries about any consequences, nothing could be further from the truth. The moment when the Israeli side went in the direction of completely taking control of the disputed land was after the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947 fell through. To further explain, the UN proposed a solution that satisfied no one, but it was a compromise: the partition of Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. And while these 2 states should have been completely independent, the actual city of Jerusalem awaited a different fate, particularly the international administration. This proposal was passed as a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly in November 1947. Still, these 2 states wouldn't have been of equal size. The proposed Jewish state would stretch to around 55%, while the Arab counterpart would hold 45%. Although the plan was supposed to balance these 2 sides, it had its flaws. The Jewish community completely let the Zionist movement represent its side, and they mostly accepted this plan. Jews were tired of war, conflicts, escalations, and massacres. They were still healing their wounds from the Holocaust and weren't ready to jump right into another conflict. Also, it was a crucial step toward the establishment of a Jewish state, internationally recognized. And after already mentioned Chaim Weizmann, who still held a large role, and Theodor Herzl, there was another important figure who took the leading role in establishing an independent state. His name was David Ben-Gurion, a leader of the Jewish Agency. Born as David Grun in 1886 in the Russian Empire, he grew up surrounded by the ideas of Zionism, but also socialism. Since the state in the collapsing Russian Empire wasn't good even for the Russians, not to mention Jews, Ben-Gurion emigrated to Palestine when he was 20. There he worked physical jobs as a laborer and soon became a leader of the workers' movement. Yet, his dream was to lead the Zionist movement, and he worked tirelessly to achieve it. Since 1920, when he already established a name for himself, Ben-Gurion dedicated himself to one goal only: the Free State of Israel. During the hard years, he became an undisputed leader of Jews in Palestine, building infrastructure and preparing this area for independence. His choice for the leader of the new state was obvious, but there was one problem. The Arabs and their allies in the neighboring states didn't accept the partition. And since the British had already left, there was only one solution. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. This proclamation, made from Tel Aviv, was both a triumph and a challenge. It marked the end of Jewish exile from their ancestral homeland. But although this exile reached an end, it was not time for celebration. It was a time for defending the declaration, since it met with violent opposition. The surrounding Arab nations launched a military intervention with only one goal: to prevent the foundation of Israel and eradicate it from the map. What happened next would ignite a conflict that would shape the future of the region for decades. The War of Independence has begun. The new Israeli state, which had an untrained military force, had to face large armies of 5 much stronger armies at once. There was the shortage of everything, especially military equipment. In the first few days of the war, this difference was quite visible, and the outnumbered Jewish forces struggled to defend the borders of their young state. But there was one thing that drove Israelisms. Their forces fought to keep the dream alive, determined to protect their homeland and their survival. They fought with everything they had, very effectively, and piece by piece, the tide had turned and they took the upper hand, gradually securing crucial territories. At this point, the front lines extended from the northern border with Lebanon through central Palestine and down into the Negev desert in the south. The Israeli forces, however, managed to reclaim key cities such as Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. But the victory wasn't complete. Jerusalem had to be divided into two parts, one under Israeli control and the other under Jordanian control. The year was 1949, and Israel defended its independence. The Arabs got much less than the UN partition plan intended for them, but the Israeli side paid a costly price for this victory. Still recovering from the Holocaust, this war added new scars to these tormented people. But the Arabs also had to recover. They lost everything. It was also their homeland, and their options were to become a minority under foreign rule or leave. And some were forced to leave. More than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced from their homes during the conflict, many of whom became refugees in neighboring Arab countries. The crisis was far from over. It was just a round one. At that moment, Israeli people finally had time to breathe again and recover from their wounds. But what was next, and how much time until the Arab nations once again form an alliance against Israel? And what if, like every time, Jews destroy their own nation from the inside in internal conflicts? The Palestine area was still very restless and always on the edge of conflict, and international diplomacy would become closely involved in Middle Eastern politics. Against all odds and through intense military conflict, Israel not only survived the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, but expanded its territory beyond what had been granted by the United Nations. Despite this military success, the future remained uncertain. Israel was surrounded by hostile neighbors, all refusing to accept the legitimacy of a sovereign Jewish state. The territorial gains Israel made during the war, while unplanned, created new complications. Ironically, some Palestinian Arabs who had initially rejected the UN partition plan were now willing to accept it, but Israel had changed its stance. Victorious on the battlefield, Israeli leaders saw little reason to accept anything less than the territory they had secured. Now, Israel faced enormous challenges. The state was permanent, but its survival depended on addressing serious problems, closed borders, trade isolation, and constant threats. Yet one issue took priority: absorbing an overwhelming influx of Jewish immigrants. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jews from across Europe and the Middle East flocked to the new state, seeking safety and a fresh start. These new citizens came from diverse cultures, many speaking no Hebrew, and integration proved difficult. But they had no alternative. The Israeli government had to lead with resolve to unify the population. Although the process was painful, the ever-present external threats created a strong sense of solidarity among the people. In 1956, one of those threats escalated into war. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a military officer who had led the 1952 revolution that overthrew Egypt's monarchy, nationalized the Suez Canal. Nasser was a passionate Arab nationalist, a fierce opponent of Israel, and a staunch anti-imperialist. His move aimed to reclaim Egypt's resources and prestige, but it provoked Britain and France, who depended on the canal for trade. At the same time, Egypt blocked the Straits of Tiran, critically damaging Israel's economy. In response, Israel joined Britain and France in a secret plan to invade Egypt. Nasser was also supporting Palestinian Fedayeen operating against Israel. Israel launched Operation Kadesh, quickly advancing through the Sinai Peninsula. The initial military success was impressive. However, international reaction was harsh. In one of the rare moments during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union demanded an immediate halt to hostilities. Under pressure, the three invading nations agreed to a ceasefire. While the blockade was lifted, Nasser emerged as a symbol of Arab resistance. Israel won militarily, but it paid a diplomatic price. Many began viewing it as a belligerent state seeking expansion. As the 1960s began, Israel turned to secrecy and intelligence. One man embodied this new strategy: Eli Cohen, a legendary spy. Born in Egypt in the 1920s to a Jewish family, Cohen faced persecution and moved to Israel in 1957. There, he was recruited by Mossad and sent undercover to Syria. Assuming the identity of a wealthy Syrian businessman, Cohen skillfully infiltrated the country's military and political elite. Cohen gained access to top-secret information, even touring military positions in the Golan Heights. In a clever act of espionage, he proposed planting trees to shade Syrian troops, unwittingly marking military locations for Israeli intelligence. Over time, Cohen transmitted detailed maps and defense plans back to Israel. But in 1965, during a radio transmission, Syrian authorities traced his signal. He was arrested, tortured, and publicly executed in Damascus, despite international appeals. To this day, Syria has refused to return his body. While Israel conducted covert operations, Arab hostility remained overt. Border clashes between Israel and Syria intensified. Meanwhile, Nasser sought to reassert his leadership in the Arab world by once again blocking the Straits of Tiran, cutting Israel off from the Red Sea. War seemed inevitable. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan massed troops on Israel's borders. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike. The result was stunning. In just 6 days, Israel defeated the combined Arab forces, capturing vast territories: the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights. In Golan, Israeli forces had an edge. Thanks to Cohen, they knew Syrian soldiers were stationed under trees. The Six-Day War radically altered the regional balance. Israel's survival was no longer in question. Arab leaders now faced the difficult truth of a permanent Jewish state in their midst. Despite securing its existence, Israel was now burdened with new dilemmas. The Palestinian issue remained unresolved, and Arab states yearned for revenge. That opportunity came 6 years later. In the meantime, Israel's newly expanded borders became points of tension, and the Arab world planned a coordinated strike. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, Judaism's holiest day, Egypt and Syria, launched a surprise attack. The objective was not to destroy Israel, but to reclaim lost land and restore pride. This time, the Arab militaries were better organized and equipped with Soviet arms. Israel was caught off guard. In the early days, Arab forces made alarming progress, but with critical support from the United States, Israel rebounded. After weeks of fierce combat, Israeli troops crossed the Suez Canal, threatening Cairo, and simultaneously advanced toward Damascus. The tables had turned. What began as a war to force Israel into negotiations now forced the Arab states to seek international mediation. By the end of October, the war ended. Israel had repelled the invasion, but its confidence was shaken. The illusion of invincibility had vanished. Both sides had suffered too much to continue down the path of endless war. Diplomacy was now essential. 5 years later, diplomacy triumphed. In 1978, under the mediation of U.S. President Jimmy Carter, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem, Begin signed the historic Camp David Accords. After 13 days of tense negotiations, Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. In exchange, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. It was a landmark moment. Peace, once unimaginable, was now within reach, though it required bitter compromises. Still, the peace was fragile. Tensions persisted. Some Arab groups and nations continued to reject Israel's right to exist, and for them, there was no room for negotiation. With them, war took a more shocking and unpredictable form. When Israel declared independence, all Arabs living in the neighborhood acted against it, and it ended badly for them. And after the wars, Israel became even larger, and the Arab people in the country became even more numerous. They were still against any new Jewish migration to Israel, but had no power to prevent it, and they were under foreign rule, treated like a minority, treated like an enemy. In 1948, the Jewish paramilitary forces massacred villagers of Deir Yassin, although the village was part of the Non-Aggression Pact. Although the official Israeli state wasn't involved, the death of 107 civilians spread fear throughout the Palestinian villages that were just waiting to be next in line. Many families fled their homes, taking only the necessities, hoping for a quick return. That never came. By the end of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, over 750,000 fled or were expelled. The Jews were not a minority in their state anymore. More than 400 villages were destroyed, and what was left of goods was taken by Israeli forces. By law, those who left were forbidden to return. The refugees turned to friendly countries that hated Israel, and even more spread that hatred against the ones who made them leave their homes. The West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria were full of refugee camps that became permanent settlements for the people who had nowhere else to go. The conditions in these were different, but nowhere good. The memory of this event, known as the Nakba, still hurts all generations of Palestinians and still fuels the tensions. They want to return and erase this symbol of injustice. On the other hand, Israelis see these events as a fight for the survival of a nation surrounded by enemies. But the Palestinians didn't want to leave the matter without a response. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization was formed. At first, it was under the tutorship of neighboring Arab governments and had more of a symbolic status without any real influence. The moment a new, young, and charismatic leader took charge of the PLO was in 1969, when all seemed lost. But he changed the course of the organization and the region's history. His name was Yasser Arafat. He was the salvation for Palestinians after the disaster of the Six-Day War and the Israeli occupation of almost all the refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza, among other territories. Although born in Cairo in 1929, Arafat's family had ties to Jerusalem, and he felt the urge of the homeland. Orphaned as a young boy, he didn't have an easy early life. During the greatest conflicts in 1948, Arafat was a student in Cairo, studying civil engineering, where he firsthand witnessed the growing hatred towards Jews. It was then that he became politically active, organizing protests and fighting for the Palestinian cause. He also turned to military tactics, and in 1959, he became one of the founders of Fatah, aiming to wage guerrilla war and free Palestine. Fatah was different. It was independent and didn't rely on Arab nations' money, so it didn't need to obey them. They wanted Palestinians to fight for Palestine. Arafat became highly influential and instantly recognizable, always wearing a keffiyeh draped around his head. People either saw him as the symbol of Palestinian resistance and suffering, or as a dangerous terrorist unwilling to negotiate. He wasn't afraid to organize attacks on Israel, which brought attention to the Palestinian cause internationally. He gained both followers and enemies. Those closest to him described him as warm and inspiring. He was the face of the movement, or at least the one they wanted to show the world. Their suffering drew the attention of the UN, especially after the Six-Day War, when more problems arose, particularly in refugee camps now under Israeli control. There, the Israeli government began building new settlements for Jewish settlers. The UN issued Resolution 242, clearly siding with the Palestinians and urging Israel to withdraw from newly occupied territories. The PLO didn't give up and continued its guerrilla war from Jordan, but problems arose when the PLO started acting independently. Tensions with Jordan escalated and eventually led to military incidents involving the Syrian army, while Israel remained a constant threat. After the events of Black September, which could be described as a Jordanian civil war, Arafat and his forces were forced out of Jordan and relocated to Lebanon, now Israel's new enemy, number one. After the Camp David Accords, Palestinians felt betrayed and responded with continued violent actions, some called terrorism, others liberation. This led to the Israeli-Lebanese War of 1982. Israel devastated Lebanon's economy, and massacres occurred on all sides. This war also involved the PLO, whom Israel blamed for the conflict. Meanwhile, Lebanese militias fought for power, and the Syrian army again tried to intervene. Ultimately, Israel demonstrated its military power and occupied South Lebanon for 15 years, securing its borders but giving rise to a new enemy, Hezbollah. As the 1980s progressed, so did the tensions. The political situation in the Holy Land was like a knot pulling tighter. There seemed to be no solution that could satisfy more than one side, and neither was willing to compromise. Then, everything changed in 1987. On December 9th, a truck driven by a Jew collided with a vehicle in the Jabalia refugee camp, killing 4 Palestinians. Just days earlier, an Israeli had been killed by a Palestinian. Many viewed the incident as revenge. Combined with poor living conditions and police treatment, this event was the final spark. Palestinians began revolting, showing civil disobedience, spraying graffiti, chanting, barricading roads, and throwing Molotov cocktails at Israeli forces. Settlements and towns became targets. The Intifada had begun. Although Israel had superior military technology, Palestinians showed remarkable resistance, sometimes throwing stones at tanks. The first Intifada wasn't as bloody as earlier clashes, but brought persistent fear on both sides. Israelis feared hidden bombs. Palestinians couldn't know if they'd be treated as civilians or combatants. More than 2,000 people lost their lives, but there were countless other victims. Teenagers and children were regularly beaten with clubs, and eventually, the UN had to intervene. The conference in Madrid in 1991 is considered the first attempt since 1948 to reconcile some of the differences between these two nations. This conference once again united the United States and the Soviet Union in a common cause, stopping the conflict in the Holy Land. During these 2 days, the Israelis negotiated with Palestinian, Jordanian, Lebanese, and Syrian diplomats. All sides were satisfied, as some big loans were promised to help heal the economy, and a few new countries recognized Israel, including Qatar, Oman, and Tunisia, all Arab nations. On the other hand, the Palestinians were happy to hear that they were recognized as a people who had been oppressed and that their matter needed to be resolved. Although the Madrid conference didn't end the conflict, it was the beginning of peace talks that would culminate in 1993 in the very north of Europe. The Israeli side also had a towering figure to match Arafat. Born in 1922, Yitzhak Rabin was a Jerusalem native, born in a settler's family. From early childhood, he adopted the vision of a free Israel state. He was part of the war in 1948, where he became known as a capable leader, pragmatic and calm. By 1967, he became Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces and one of the main heroes of the victory in the Six-Day War. Still, he wasn't satisfied with the direction Israel was going, establishing rule by brute force. That's why Rabin entered politics and even became Israel's first native-born prime minister in 1974. It was during his second term that he paved his way into the history books with his peaceful intentions. From the Madrid conference, the secret negotiations continued, mostly in Oslo. Curiously, even though these treaties are named after the Norwegian capital, they were signed elsewhere, mainly in Washington and Taba in Egypt. Norway was the mediator in the process. And although the Oslo Accords of 1993 didn't actually resolve the conflict, they were the beginning of the process of reconciliation, a process that was never completed. Some of the main outcomes were that Israel, for the first time, officially recognized the PLO and Arafat as the ones who represent the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority was also established, and the Palestinians got some autonomy in specific areas, while others remained disputed. The handshake between Rabin and Yasser Arafat became a powerful symbol of hope and courage, and brought them the Nobel Prize for Peace. But many didn't see it that way. Many Palestinians felt betrayed by their leadership, and continued with terrorist actions and planting bombs. Others were happy because they were allowed to return to their homes. In Israel, the treaty also had mixed reception. Many felt that Rabin gave away territories that were conquered by Israeli blood. One group even organized and carried out the assassination of Rabin, who left the stage of life in 1995. Like Rabin's life after the Accords, the peace was short-lived. But before his death, Rabin made one more step toward peace. This one was with King Hussein of Jordan. These two leaders signed an agreement formally ending a 46-year state of war between the two nations. Unlike the one with the Palestinians, this treaty remained firm. But with Palestine, the most important questions weren't resolved. Uncertainty continued, and soon enough, the Second Intifada began. Unlike the first one, this uprising, which broke out in September 2000, was much bloodier on both sides. Ariel Sharon, the leader of the opposition in Israel, decided to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Sharon, a former military commander during the wars, was known for his firm and often violent approach to the crisis. Although the visit itself was peaceful, it was seen as a provocation, and riots began almost immediately. Protests turned into conflict, and the massive uprising lasted for 5 years. Sharon became prime minister the following March and led the Israeli side. Palestinian militants began using suicide bombings and armed attacks against Israeli civilians. On the other hand, Israel started assassinating notable Palestinian figures and occupied key areas, often violently. The West Bank was the main place of violence. There, Israel had a military objective: destroy Palestinian military structures and disarm people. Fertile soil for atrocities. They created the West Bank barrier, which made the Palestinians feel even worse. As the years passed, nothing changed. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued, and Palestinian factions were divided over how best to achieve their goals. Yasser Arafat couldn't establish control over these groups, and he passed away in 2004. After his death, the Islamist group Hamas became the main Palestinian organization in Gaza, while Fatah controlled the West Bank. The peace process stopped, and Israel returned to unilateral solutions. The Intifada ended in 2005 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where Sharon and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas signed a treaty pledging to contain their forces, but without any real arrangements. Israel promised to leave the once again occupied territories and released 900 Palestinian prisoners. Still, the problems and disputes remained. But during these wars, Israel survived and progressed, even becoming the main force in the region. And these people have only themselves to thank for that, because the progress of a nation that was and still is surrounded by enemies and with limited natural resources is astonishing. Today, Israel is one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world, and the Jews are one of the most efficient executives in the world. And how come the nation that faced so much oppression and genocide survived all that and rose above it to become what it is today? Well, the rapid transformation of Israel into a technological powerhouse started from bare necessity. This nation was surrounded by enemies who didn't want anything to do with them, so any trade was out of the question. So, the Israelis were on their own. The next step was to find people who were creative. Luckily, there were, and still are, many Jewish people who are among the most talented people in the world. The last thing was a national strategy to improve the nation in these fields needed for great functioning and progress. The first and the most important task in 1948 was to become self-reliant. And one of the most important figures in this progress to innovation was Shimon Peres. Peres, today mostly known as the architect of Israel's nuclear power, as the Prime Minister of Israel in the 1980s and the 90s, was one of the pioneers of the vital cooperation between the government, scientists, and the private sector. His actions led to the creation of the Iron Dome missile defense system, a technological marvel, but also a necessity for Israel and its development under pressure. However, military advancement and technology are not everything, and some of the budget for inventions needed to go in the direction of other technologies. Technologies that would make the Israeli name famous in the world. And this is the moment where the story leads us to Yossi Vardi. Yossi Vardi was a dreamer who saw potential in every situation, no matter how difficult the circumstances were. Born in Israel, he started his journey believing in the power of ideas. In the mid-1990s, he became the most important person in the company that created ICQ, the world's first instant messaging platform. This possibility changed the world of the internet in a matter of seconds. His success was something that inspired others. Soon, his discovery was sold to AOL, and after him, Israel became the startup nation. But Vardi isn't just a man in pursuit of profit. His passion for innovation is his driving force. Also, Vardi proved to be a great mentor, capable of spotting talent among others. His journey personified Israel's desire to become what it is today. Following his footsteps, or even going in front of him, many Jews started founding startups in the 1990s and early 2000s. And many major high-tech companies established centers in Israel because it is fertile soil for ideas, among them Intel and Microsoft. And the results soon arrived in technologies like Waze, Mobileye, and Checkpoint software. Yet, it is very symptomatic that these technologies mostly involve security, which is connected with the Israeli situation and possible terrorist attacks. But Israel today is so much more than just technological advancement. Many people who consider Israel a home today have descendants who arrived in the Holy Land from all across Europe and even other continents. In their families and their way of thinking in life, there are still many habits typical of their former homelands. This cultural diversity and mixture of ideas plays an equally significant role in the nation's character as technology. Each of these groups of settlers contributes to the society with unique traditions, cuisines, and artistic expressions. Figures such as Amos Oz and David Grossman have used literature to explore the complexities of Israeli identity. And in music, artists like Aidan Rachel mix traditional sounds with modern influences, showing how tradition can always be modern. Many famous world stars today are from Israel or have roots in Israel, and among them Gal Gadot and Natalie Portman. Some other Jewish actors have ties with Israel, like Jeff Goldblum. But this diversity also made some internal divisions, especially economic differences. This economic inequality and the ever-growing gap between the country's prosperous high-tech sector and its peripheral agricultural communities. Also, there are political differences, especially the question of how much religion should be included in state politics. Current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also a polarizing figure among the people, where most of the nation is happy with how he conducts times of external crisis and his actions, while there are many dissatisfied with his internal politics and his actions that led to festering this economic polarization of the society. Still, despite all other problems, the main preoccupation for Israel remains the geopolitical situation, dynamics surrounding Israel, which is much more dangerous than its internal affairs. As the years progressed, the main partner and ally for Israel became the United States. The most powerful nation in the world helped Israel beat the political regional isolation. The Abraham Accords, mostly supported by the United States under President Donald Trump, really changed these regional relations. These agreements normalized ties between Israel and several Arab nations, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. These nations now have flights between them, and even started trade relations as the safest path to peace. Figures such as Jared Kushner and Yossi Cohen, former head of Mossad, were the leaders of these negotiations that could bring more certainty to this region in the future. Still, there are always new or old enemies. Iran and Turkey have disputes over territory with Israel. These are powerful nations, and the tensions with them are never easy. The main advantage that Israel has is its relationship with the United States as a diplomatic protector that can provide military aid, tied with shared research initiatives and economic agreements. But that's not all. Israel also improved its relations with India, where Israeli experts helped in developing the technology of this most populous nation. But the problem remains in the neighborhood, and that not only remains, it intensifies. And the story will once again take a sinister turn. Today, although there are some exceptions, Israel is still surrounded by hostile nations. Even if the governments of these nations sign treaties with Israel, there is still hatred among people. And some of these people who hate Israel even live in Israel, in refugee camps in bad conditions, not fearing anything because they have nothing to lose. The most well-known, and one that is the most difficult to resolve, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After the partial resolution, after the Second Intifada, the deep mistrust between the two people remained, fueled by occasional massacres committed by either of these sides. The construction of the West Bank barrier, like the Berlin Wall of the East, physically represents that barrier and the division between the two communities. And from that moment, it all went from bad to worse. The main problems of the conflict are the status of Jerusalem, the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and the blockade of the Gaza Strip. These three differences today seem inevitable. Jerusalem, a city sacred to all three major religions, remains a flashpoint since it is the capital city of Israel. The Israeli side claims over the entire city and won't accept any other solution, while the Palestinian aspirations for East Jerusalem as their capital. Some negotiations between the two sides, led by Saeb Erekat, a longtime Palestinian negotiator, and successive Israeli prime ministers, including Benjamin Netanyahu, ultimately failed. There is also the blockade of Gaza, enforced by Israel in 2007, since that is the year when Hamas took control over this territory. This blockade further heightened the tensions. The Hamas side claims that this blockade causes humanitarian catastrophe, while the Israeli side has a different explanation in order to avoid militant attacks from this aggressive group. Hamas leaders like Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar have led the organization towards both governance and armed confrontation, leading to repeated cycles of violence. Israel's military operations, such as the 2014 Gaza War, highlight its strategy of preemptive strikes and robust defense, exemplified by the Iron Dome missile defense system. And the last terrorist attack on Israeli civilians at the music festival started a new war that is still in progress, and this time, bloodier than ever. Historians have yet to give their opinion on this moment in time, but this is far from the only problem in the close proximity. In the last few decades, Israel's main rival in the region became the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the tensions just rise. Iran is very different from the other Arab nations, and Israel's alliance with the US even more fuels the hatred. Iran's ideological opposition to Israel's existence and its support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas have created even more hostilities. Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat to Israel and the #1 subject of every Israeli security concern. Covert operations, including cyber attacks and targeted strikes on Iranian facilities, show Israel's approach to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear capabilities. New missiles from both sides launched in the last few months brought these two nations to the very edge of war. On the other side, Hezbollah, as an Iranian ally, operates from southern Lebanon and presents a significant security challenge. Its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has transformed the organization into a dangerous military force, supported by Iranian funding and weaponry. The 2006 Lebanon War showed how dangerous this enemy is. Preventive airstrikes against it didn't neutralize the organization. Unlike these, the tensions with Turkey are not that dangerous, and these are more diplomatic than and change from time to time. The same applies to the relations with the Gulf states. The main reason why Israel still exists is the Mossad and their operations, as one of the most capable secret intelligence in the world. From the abductions of the infamous Nazis to the assassination of the main enemies, this organization does everything to protect Israel, no matter what it takes. In 2018, Mossad managed to extract Iranian nuclear documents and weaken their nuclear program. Today, when we look back on the history of Israel and its people, Their very existence is an act of heroism and a testament to resilience and renewal. A story that begins in the biblical era as the beginning of monotheism. Notable people like King David and Solomon still remain very important in the history of the world, and the destruction of this state still captivates artists. Many nations ruled over the Holy Land, from the Romans to Christians and Muslims up until the modern era and Israel. All of them carved their presence in the spirit of this land. But the moment that changed everything happened with the modern rebirth of Israel in 1948. After centuries of diaspora, persecution, and struggle, against all odds, this state survived the horrors of the Holocaust and successfully defended its statehood in the early days. Over time, the defender became the attacker who significantly enlarged its nation and grew into a technological powerhouse and a beacon of innovation, balancing ancient traditions with modern achievements. Still, there are many challenges along the road, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that need to be resolved. In these relations lies the key to peace in the Middle East. But this area was never peaceful. Today, Israel is not only a regional power, but also an important player in the world scene. With cutting-edge technology and strong alliances, it still remains one of the most important nations in the world in every way.